For the second straight year, the Edmonton Oilers came up short in the Stanley Cup Final. On today's edition of Locked On Oilers, an investigation into what went wrong, where the Oilers can improve, and we start to set the tone for what is going to be a fascinating offseason of change.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. That wraps up my second Stanley Cup Finals run as host of Locked On Oilers, and I want to thank everyone that is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we've got your team covered every day, and thank you to everybody who jumped on the ride throughout the course of the postseason, or if you were an everydayer that was there back in November and December and January and in the trenches, whenever you got on board, I'd want to thank you for being here, for listening to today's show. And just as a reminder, yes, this sucks. Yes, I am still quite upset, but the Oilers will play hockey again in the fall. There will be NHL games again in a few months, and we need our time to recalibrate, and that naturally bears out to today's episode. And I am roughly calling this an audit, but this can be an autopsy, an audit, a performance review, if you will. And we're going to start that with talking about what really failed the Oilers in this series at large and where their deficiencies ultimately became too much to overcome. Then, in our second segment, we're going to pivot to talking about the McDavid-Draisaitl minutes together, why that didn't work particularly well in this series. Big key, Florida just being a really good hockey team. And then we'll take the 10,000-foot view. We'll put some of these deficiencies, some of these problems into their proper context. We'll talk about them with the forward-looking outlook of the offseason and where the Oilers go from here. But to start things out, to get to Game 6 of the Stanley Cup Final is something, okay? It is an accomplishment. Is it satisfactorily? No. We know the expectation when the Oilers have the talent they do is that they win the Stanley Cup. They entered this year with that cup or bust mindset. And I spent a lot of time deliberating over this the last few days, last few shows. Yesterday, I talked quite in depth about how you contextualize these moments, these games, these wins, these losses. It largely bears out on you, the individual, because for me, there's a part of me that's okay, Florida's truly a special team. 2 straight years you win the Stanley Cup in the final, 3 straight years. One of the deepest forward groups we've ever seen, a future Hall of Fame goalie, and that's a really good team. And the Oilers did not have their best game. I would say the Oilers probably put their best hockey together in those Vegas and Dallas series consecutively. And since then, they've had glimmers of good hockey. They've had flashes of good play. But I think if you want to understand the differences between the Oilers this year versus last year and why the Oilers only got to 6 games this year as opposed to 7, I think you got to look no further than the special teams. I genuinely think the Oilers special teams deficiencies this year in particular held them back from closing the margins, because at 5-on-5, the numbers were relatively comparable to what they were last year as far as goal distribution and the McDavid-Draisaitl minutes, goals overall. But you look at that in the context of the offense they were able to produce this year on the power play and the defensive warts of the penalty kill. And there are explanations, and some people will say you're making excuses. No, they're explanations. You took a 50-goal guy off of the power play at the net front, and as good a player as Corey Perry is, 10 goals in the playoffs, 19 goals in the regular season, Corey Perry can't be your third best forward if you would like to win the Stanley Cup in 2025. And with Zach Hyman entirely out of the lineup with an injury and Ryan Nugent-Hopkins playing compromised, the Oilers did not have the depth that had made them so successful earlier in these playoffs. And health is such a crucial factor. You look at how healthy the Panthers were in comparison. And I know guys like Matthew Tkachuk playing with torn hip abductor, Sam Reinhart playing with a knee sprain, but you at least had those guys in the lineup and playing at a reasonably high level. Ryan Nugent-Hopkins had moments, he had flashes, especially in that game 4, one of the driving factors in manifesting that comeback, but depleting results as the series went along. No Zach Hyman at all, not even a token one shift the way Steven Stamkos was back in 2020 before he tore his hip in returning from injury there. So you start there. The power play losing that component, that net front play, that quality interplay at the net front where the Oilers could play the game tight in that phone booth. And now you think about the Oilers power play without that, and it's a lot of point shots. And I am an Evan Bouchard defender. Anybody who has listened to the show, the everydayers have heard me singing his praises all season long. I genuinely think he's their third best player behind McDavid and Draisaitl. But if that's the guy who is taking a majority of your shots, who leads your team in shots on goal for a series, and his one-timer is becoming your default play, you are not running as efficient of a power play as you need to be if you would like to be successful. The reason teams will let that defenseman take that big point shot, even for someone who's as good at shooting the puck as Evan Bouchard is, they are going to let you do that because those shots from 30 to 50 feet away, it's a lot easier to get a body in front of it. Or if it's a clear line of sight, Bobrovsky can slide on over and get in the way. So with your power play, not getting Leon to that one-timer spot, McDavid not having the room to take the puck in tight and do his little jitterbug moves, you're left with uninspiring options. You're left with Corey Perry jam plays. You're left with Ryan Nugent-Hopkins or Evander Kane on that opposite side, on their offside, trying to find a way to score from a sharp angle past a great goalie. And you got to sit here and you feel that the Oilers are... It's not that they're not close. It's that between this year and last year, Florida got better. The Oilers were better, I would say, in the playoffs in the first 2 rounds. They played really well against Dallas and Vegas this year in a way they didn't against Vancouver and Dallas last year. But you got to the final, and the difference is in the special teams numbers. I'm going to click on over to my notes here because I want to read them. But this year in the playoffs, the Oilers outscored the Panthers 4-1 on the power play. Last year, 3-0. Okay, not that big a difference. This year, the big difference being the penalty kill. Last year, in the Stanley Cup Final, through 7 games, the Oilers outscored the Panthers 2-1 on the penalty kill. This year, they were outscored 7-0. And think about it in terms of football. When you are trying to beat a team that's better than you, you need something a little funky. You need a pick six. You need a blocked punt. You need a blocked field goal. You need something to give yourself an extra possession. And last year in the Stanley Cup Final, those were the shorthanded goals. Getting 2 shorthanded goals in the same series from your penalty kill against a team that's controlling play, especially at 5-on-5, that is a real shortcut. That's cutting a corner on the course and getting where you need to end up. Because when you can find ways to get contributions from your even strength, from your power play, from your penalty kill, you have so many more options. But this year, the penalty kill was awful. This year, the power play was good. It still was okay. It just didn't convert as high of a rate as it did last year. And then you didn't have that second goal guy. You know, Hyman led the entire playoffs in goals last year. And without that extra piece, both at even strength and on the power play, the Oilers really struggled to get their offense going. And I think that's the story of this series for me. Yes, the goaltending was not great. Yes, the penalty kill was not great. But the Oilers' inability to consistently generate offense, to play in the offensive zone, it really wore them down over the course of this series, and it put them in a disadvantageous position where they were constantly chasing, and they needed to put Connor and Leon together. And speaking of putting Connor and Leon together, coming up next on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, I'm going to tell you why the Oilers putting those two together as frequently as they did probably was their undoing and why they lost this series on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. Are you looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein today with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily nutritional value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you, unsaturated fats to help you keep feeling fuller for longer. Personally, I love the no-shell variety. It's the perfect grab-and-go snack for busy days, whether I'm at my desk, working on the show, doing research or editing, or if I just need a quick protein fix at the end of the day, they're a great go-to. Or if you're old school and you love cracking open every shell for that satisfying crunch, the in-shell options are a classic favorite. Wonderful Pistachios is a complete protein that provides all 9 essential amino acids. Get snacking and get cracking with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on today's edition of Locked On Oilers after a eye-opening Stanley Cup Final is the way I would describe it, because the Oilers are close. And we know in today's NHL, the hardest part of getting to that finish line is going from being a good team to a great team. And right now, the Oilers, as constructed, have the bones of a very good team. They have 2 of the 5 best players in the entire world in McDavid and Draisaitl. They have one of the 10 best defensemen in the world in Evan Bouchard. They have one of the 10 best defensive defensemen in the world in Mattias Ekholm when he's healthy. He was not great in this series, coming off of a major injury, coming off of a long layoff. It's understandable he would look rusty. He wouldn't look up to game speed. I'm willing to give Ekholm a mulligan as far as looking forward to next season. You have Jake Wallman, who is overqualified to be a second-pair defenseman on a good team. You have guys like Darnell Nurse, who are capable of better hockey, even though the frustration is definitely reaching a breaking point there. You have pieces like Zach Hyman, who are good for 30 to 40 goals in a healthy year. You have Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, who's capable of 60 to 70 points. And then the question becomes filling in the gap. That comes back into where do the Oilers go from here? Because when the Oilers are at their best, it's largely been a McDavid and Draisaitl led affair. It has been those 2 guys playing at a very high level, and the breaking case of emergency that when the Oilers have been in trouble with Chris Knoblauch at the helm, it has been, and frankly, not just Knoblauch, this goes back all the way to Ken Hitchcock, but when you play McDavid with Draisaitl, your expectation is we will dominate those minutes and we'll figure out everything else. That's your shortcut, your cheat code. If we dominate those minutes and they play together for 24, 25 minutes in a do or die playoff game, all right, the other 35 minutes we're going to need to piece together, but we need to kill in the minutes those guys are together. And this year, it just did not come together in the way it has in years past. Definitely no Zach Hyman. Hurts. Hyman with them last year was a dominating force and was an effective cheat where those 2 guys occupy so much oxygen and take away so many opportunities for other teams to contain them because they're so dangerous. And this year, as good as I thought Corey Perry was in the playoffs, he lacks an element of dynamism to his game that would make him a top 6 forward on a Stanley Cup contender. And look, that's not a knock. Corey Perry's 40 years old. He has played more hockey in his life than most people can comprehend. The amount of miles and the fact he was still able to be so effective, all of those factors, and he was still a productive player. 10 goals in the playoffs is nothing to sneeze at for a guy at his age. That's the type of player you need to find in that niche depth role where he, in the regular season, he's not making a lot of money. He plays very sparingly, but he's very efficient in the few chances he does get. But sitting here now, you know that the Oilers are further away than they were after last year's final. And it's frustrating because on paper, this team was better. Talent-wise, especially on defense, when you have a Wallman and a Klingberg in spot of a Desharnais and a Ceci, those are massive upgrades. And I know Klingberg had a rough final, but up until that point, he had been lights out in the first 3 rounds. And I think that's really something that was eye-opening to me. So in the Stanley Cup final, McDavid and Draisaitl together in their 50-ish minutes in 25 minutes at 5-on-5, outscored 5-1. Last year in the Stanley Cup final, they won those minutes 2-1. Last year in the Stanley Cup Final, McDavid without Draisaitl outscored opponents 5-1. This year in the Stanley Cup Final, the crazy thing, the Oilers finished under 50% of the goal share in every permutation with at least one of McDavid or Draisaitl on the ice. So if you have one of those guys or them together, they were outscored in the final. The Oilers in the non-McDavid Draisaitl minutes at 5-on-5, they tied the Panthers at 4-4. The Oilers were not able to get the most out of their stars. And some of that is a testament to the Florida Panthers, who, when they need it, they have as good a defensive group as possible. Where if you're going to roll Ekblad and Forsling as the defenders to block shots, to take away space, you have Barkov and you have Reinhart, two of the Selke finalists for this past NHL season. And their sole responsibility is going to be making McDavid and Draisaitl work hard for their offense. It becomes a Herculean task, because if you play Connor and Leon together and they're not scoring, what does that do to everyone else? Because without Leon to carry a second line, you're asking someone like Nuge or Evander Kane to have to be a bit of a conduit to channel the energy of their line mates. And neither of those guys, though good hockey players, are anywhere near what Leon or Connor are capable of on an individual basis. So with that in mind, you got to think about it from a risk assessment, because when this team gets to their game, it's a lot of speed. It's a lot of transition. It's making opponents off balanced. And in this final, the Oilers' ability to make the Panthers off balance, it wasn't very common. It was few and far in between in this series where the Oilers were able to make things happen for themselves, other than some individual splash plays. And those splash plays, those odd man rushes, the Nurse goal, the Arvidsson goal, the Leon overtime winner in both games, those come off of chaos. Those come off of miscommunications and mistakes. And if you can't consistently get to those situations to put Florida in difficult situations, that's when your offense starts to dry up. And that, for me, creates the trickle-down effect where everything else stops working. Because if the Oilers aren't dangerous offensively, they're not spending a lot of time in the Florida zone. Because they're not spending a lot of time in the Florida zone, they're ending up a lot of transition play and a lot of time in their own end. And when you spend as much time in your own end as the Oilers did in this series against Florida, and Florida loves to play it simple, that's what makes Florida so efficient. Is their game is very straightforward. It's very simple. It's very honest. They don't cheat it. They play 200 feet. They force you into mistakes. They make you uncomfortable. And the Oilers were not able to adapt as this series went along. As it progressed, the Oilers got more and more clustered. They got more and more hemmed in. And those sequences start to wear away at you. They break you down. And ultimately, were the Oilers' undoing. The first two goals in Game 6, the closeout game, are direct byproducts of turnovers. The first one is Ekholm throwing Bouchard a hand grenade because he's got to get rid of it. He knows the forecheck's coming. And Bouchard fails to move that puck along. Reinhart, who's an elite defensive forward, goes the other way and scores. And then the second goal, the Tkachuk goal off the trail, the Oilers gain the offensive zone, but they tried to go left to right as opposed to in deep, turnover at the top. Florida goes the other way, waits for the trailer, finds Tkachuk goal. And 2-0 when you're not scoring feels like a mountain. And that, for me, is the telltale sign the Oilers were overmatched, is they just did not have the requisite offense. And yeah, the goaltending wasn't good and the defense wasn't good, but we know this team is built from the front back. The expectation is that Connor and Leon will do a majority of the heavy lifting. And they didn't have bad series. Both guys were point per game. But for the Oilers to have won this series, to have it gone the other way, they would have needed to pull genuinely special performances out of those two guys. And it just wasn't in the cards for them against an elite defensive team. But we are going to take our second and final break of today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, I'm going to explain to you what the Oilers can start to think about and where we go from here right after this quick break. So be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. And After a Stanley Cup final like that, you have to take account. You have to audit. You have to try and learn. And the biggest key to me in these evaluations is not overreacting and being reasonable. Because right now, sitting here, after losing to Florida for the second straight year and in more convincing fashion the second time, there are some hard questions to be asked here. How do the Oilers maintain where they are and get better? Because that's the key. Obviously, the Oilers are a good team. You don't win 6 playoff series over the course of 2 years if you're not a good team. But 2 years in a row now, they have come up short against Florida. They made roster decisions both in free agency last summer and the trades they made in season with the idea of being prepared specifically for Florida. They went out and got Wallman. They brought in Klingberg. They went for puck-moving defensemen as opposed to guys like CC and Desharnais who are a bit more inclined to eat pucks, to eat minutes, and really be outplayed but survive. Then, as means of trying to mitigate the fact they couldn't score enough last year, they went out and got Victor Arvidsson, who's been a 60-point forward, and they went out and got Jeff Skinner, who's been a multi-time 30-goal scorer in the NHL. All of the decisions the Oilers made in trying to improve the roster from last year to this year were organized around the idea of needing to beat the Panthers. And very clearly, to varying degrees, those moves did not work. And I still think Jake Wallman and John Klingberg have roles. I know Klingberg isn't under contract. Wallman is. I would like to see a world where John Klingberg sticks as the third pair right-handed defenseman and maybe Ty Emberson rotates in for 30 to 40 games. But at the same time, I would understand if John Klingberg wanted to go somewhere else to get a solidified roster spot, being that he showed how well he can play at times earlier in this postseason. So the first big question I have, how do the Oilers get their accounting squared away? So number one, Leon's extension is going to kick in. Draisaitl is about to become the highest paid player in the NHL. The Oilers also need to pay Connor McDavid. They also need to pay Evan Bouchard. Evan Bouchard is a restricted free agent with arbitration rights, so he's a bit more boxed in. Could a crazy team swoop in with an offer sheet for Evan Bouchard? Yeah, it's not out of the realm of possibility. He's a special player. He's one of the best defensemen in the NHL. And for all of his mistakes, all of his warts, there are a lot of teams that would like to have a problem as good as Evan Bouchard is. And like we sit here and like we do, you got to find ways to improve. So, do you look at some of the unrestricted free agents, the guys who could be moved, someone like a Connor Brown? Okay. Are you going to replace Connor Brown with anyone that much better than him? I know his regular season left a little bit to be desired. He was okay, pretty good, okay in the playoffs. Janmark, he still got under contract. You're going to bring Corey Perry back? There are just so many little questions. The biggest one being, what are you going to do in net? Because after a second straight year where the casual take coming out of the final is that your goaltending wasn't good enough, and frankly, I want to get this on the record. The goaltending wasn't good, but it's not the reason the Oilers lost this series. The single biggest reason the Oilers lost is they didn't score enough. When you aren't scoring, you're scoring 1 or 2 goals in the games you're losing. You're not giving your goalie a chance. And I know Florida's a great team. I know the Oilers were stymied to some degree. They're dealing with injuries. But you need to find ways to be resourceful, to wear teams down, to manufacture offense, to work a walk and then steal second. Get yourself into scoring position. That's your goal when things are going tough. When you can't get a thing going, you want to get pucks in deep. You want to try and work the other team into mistakes. And the Oilers did not have the personnel for it, and they weren't able to execute at the level they needed to if they wanted to pull this off. And again, it's a two-way street. It's not just that the Oilers didn't play well. Florida is a very good hockey team, and both of those can coexist at the same time as equal talking points. The Oilers left hockey on the table. They did not play their best in this series. At the same time, the Panthers are a really good team. When you have the level of depth that you can play Marchand, Lundell, and Luosterainen as your third line and take advantage of that in comparison to what the Oilers were icing as their third line at points with Adam Henrique, Trent Frederick, or Janmark, or Brown, or Evander Kane, or Jeff Skinner, whoever you want to say, nobody of that permutation I just said cracks that Panthers third line. Marchand's better than all of them. Lundell is better than all of them. Luosterainen is better than all of them. And when that's your team opponent's third line and your best players are getting outscored, it becomes very easy to see how this falls apart the way it did for the Oilers. And now you have a few serious questions. Number one, how do you improve overall? And not just stay where you are. How do you get better? Does that mean you're trading Arvidsson because you want his cap space? You're going to let Jeff Skinner walk. We know he's not coming back because Chris Knobloch just didn't see a fit for him with what he wanted to do. Okay, so you need to replace Skinner and Arvidsson. You may need to replace Klingberg. You may need to replace Ekholm. Maybe you want to trade Ekholm at 35 in a walk year and try and extract some value, get younger, get cheaper. No, you're not going to do that because you're a Stanley Cup contender. Stanley Cup contenders don't trade their best defensive defenseman. Okay, so how do we get better? Well, we're going to replace Corey Perry. With who? Where are you finding 19 goals in free agency for less than $2 million? Okay, that's the kind of questions we're going to be asking ourselves for a while, or at least till free agency in 2 weeks when we have more answers. But for now, the Oilers need to improve. That is undoubtedly the truth. And some of that is the guys who are here need to play more in line with their standards. Some of that is guys coming back from injuries like Zach Hyman, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins have more to give. But frankly, and I have to say this, more likely than not, you're taking a step back next year. More likely than not, you're not making a conference final or a Stanley Cup final again, just by the virtue of how difficult this league is, by how difficult these playoffs are. You put together two great efforts to get to the Cup final 2 years in a row, and you found the one team that was better than you both times. It's unfair, but sports are inherently unfair. You are always going to eventually find someone that's better than you, even in small instances. You know, the Panthers were the better team in this series. The Oilers still managed to win 2 games and could have very easily had forced a game 7 should they have won game 2. I mean, it's not, that's how small the margins are in the NHL, that a series that kind of felt like it got out of hand, especially in games 5 and 6, the Oilers are one overtime goal away from being in a game 7 against a team that had thoroughly outplayed them. And that's what makes this all the more frustrating, because now you got to go back to square one. You got to go to free agency, the draft. You got to try and improve. You got to try and build your team up over the months throughout the course of the regular season. You want to be getting close to peaking at the right time. So that way, by the time mid-April, early May comes around and you're in that second round of the playoffs, you're playing really good hockey. So that way you can continue to get better. And then by the time the Stanley Cup Final rolls around, you're ready to go against a team that is equally as good, if not better than you. And that's the challenge. Can the Oilers find that energy and get to that next level? Because this is the highest level there is. Being the Stanley Cup champion, to quote Ric Flair, to be the man, you got to beat the man. And for 2 years in a row, the Oilers have come up short. Varying degrees of short, but they have come up short. And that means it's time to change some things, whether that's personnel, strategy, assistant coaches, whatever it might be. The Oilers need to get better, not maintain. They need to actively get better. But that will do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, be sure to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and hit that alarm bell so you get a notification whenever new content goes live. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.